There's a specific category of language worth examining directly, not accusations, not obvious lies, but something considerably more insidious. Sentences specifically engineered to make you doubt not just a single fact, but your entire capacity to accurately perceive reality itself. Today, we're tracing three specific sentences that accomplish exactly this, why they prove so uniquely effective, and how to recognize and neutralize them the moment they arrive. Sentence 1. That's not what happened. Delivered with complete, unwavering confidence, without any accompanying evidence, without any specific alternative account offered. Simply flat, confident contradiction of your own clear, direct memory. Here's why this specific sentence proves so uniquely powerful, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about gaslighting's erosion of self-trust. Remember what we've established about how confidence itself functions as a kind of evidence in the absence of anything else to evaluate. Most people, encountering flat, unhesitating contradiction of something they'd otherwise consider certain, instinctively begin second-guessing themselves, precisely because genuine confidence typically correlates with genuine accuracy in most ordinary human interaction. This sentence exploits exactly this instinct, weaponizing simple, unwavering delivery to produce doubt regardless of how accurate your original memory actually was. Here's the specific mechanism worth understanding. This sentence works not through argument, but through sheer, repeated assertion. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narrative combat depends on providing material to work with. This sentence provides nothing to argue against directly, no specific counterclaim to examine, no alternative timeline to compare against your own. It simply asserts contradiction, forcing you into the position of having to prove a negative, defend your own memory against nothing more substantial than confident denial. Sentence 2. You're remembering it wrong because you were upset. This sentence proves particularly effective because it doesn't deny the event occurred entirely. It concedes something happened while simultaneously undermining your capacity to have perceived it accurately, using your own genuine emotional response as evidence against your own reliability. Here's why this sentence proves so uniquely damaging, connecting to something we've traced extensively throughout this entire series about how emotional reactivity gets weaponized against the person experiencing it. Remember everything we've traced about how narcissists sometimes deliberately provoke exactly the emotional intensity they later use as evidence of unreliability. This sentence creates a genuinely difficult trap. The more upset you were during the original incident, a completely reasonable, understandable response to whatever actually occurred, the more evidence this sentence claims exists for dismissing your accurate memory of it. Your own legitimate emotional response becomes retroactively weaponized against your own credibility. Sentence 3. Everyone agrees with me on this. This sentence introduces a third, particularly insidious mechanism worth understanding directly, invoking imagined or exaggerated consensus specifically to make you doubt not simply your memory of a single event, but your broader sense of social reality itself. Here's why this sentence proves so effective, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about isolation as a strategic tool. Remember what we've established about how narcissistic strategy often specifically works to distance you from outside perspective. This sentence exploits genuine evolutionary human sensitivity to social consensus. Most people find isolated disagreement genuinely uncomfortable, and the suggestion that everyone holds a contrary view produces powerful pressure toward doubting your own position, regardless of whether this claimed consensus reflects anything close to reality. Let's trace exactly how to recognize and neutralize each of these three sentences in real time, because understanding the theory behind why they work matters considerably less than actually having a reliable, practical response ready for the moment they arrive. Here's how to respond to "That's not what happened." Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust, the specific power of acknowledging a difference in perception without requiring resolution of that difference in order to feel settled yourself. Rather than defending your own memory extensively, providing detailed evidence, or escalating into extended argument about who's accurately remembering what. The effective response is remarkably simple. That's how I remember it. Full stop, offered calmly, without accompanying justification. This response accomplishes something crucial worth understanding directly. It doesn't require winning the disagreement in order to protect your own internal certainty. You're not trying to convince him your memory is accurate. You're simply calmly stating that your memory remains what it is, regardless of his confident denial. Here's how to respond to, "You're remembering it wrong because you were upset." This requires a slightly different approach because it introduces the specific claim that your emotional state disqualifies your perception. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the crucial distinction between feeling something intensely and that intensity somehow invalidating accurate observation. The effective response here involves directly separating these two things. Being upset doesn't mean I misremember what happened. This response refuses the specific logical trap the original sentence attempts to construct, the false equation between emotional intensity and unreliable perception. Without requiring extended debate about whether your emotional response was justified or proportionate, here's how to respond to, "Everyone agrees with me on this." Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narrative control depending on unverifiable claims that sound authoritative without actually providing anything concrete to examine. The effective response here involves simply calmly declining to accept an unverified claim as evidence. I haven't heard that from anyone directly, so I'll trust my own experience. This response doesn't require you to investigate or verify whether this claimed consensus actually exists. It simply calmly refuses to treat an unverified assertion as though it constitutes genuine evidence requiring your capitulation. Here's something crucial worth understanding about what all three of these responses share in common, connecting extensively to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about detachment being the ultimate protective mechanism. Remember what we've established about how these three sentences all depend on the same underlying mechanism, producing enough doubt that you eventually abandon your own accurate perception in favor of his confidently asserted alternative. Each of the three responses we've traced throughout today's discussion shares the same underlying structure: brief acknowledgement of the disagreement's existence, followed by calm, complete refusal to resolve that disagreement in his favor, without requiring extended argument or extended emotional investment in order to feel genuinely settled. Here's something important worth understanding about implementing these responses successfully. They work best delivered with genuine calm rather than defensive urgency. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissists remain remarkably skilled at detecting underlying anxiety hiding beneath even carefully chosen words. If these responses are delivered with visible desperation, visible need for him to eventually agree with you, they lose considerable effectiveness, transforming from genuine, settled statements of fact into another variation of exactly the extended combat these three original sentences are specifically designed to provoke. Here's a fourth, important layer worth adding to everything we've traced throughout today's conversation. Documentation as ongoing protection against the cumulative effect of these three sentences repeated over time. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about documentation protecting your own clarity, independent of any single conversation's outcome. Because these three sentences work partly through repetition, gradually eroding confidence in your own perception across many instances rather than through any single decisive conversation. Maintaining your own private, accurate record of what actually happened provides crucial ongoing protection against exactly this cumulative erosion. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a set of counter phrases without addressing what genuinely matters most. How these three sentences and your responses to them connect to the deeper foundation this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations, and what genuine, lasting protection against reality rewriting actually requires beyond simply memorizing the right responses. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. These responses work most powerfully once they emerge from genuine, internalized self-trust rather than functioning as scripts you're reciting while secretly still hoping he'll eventually validate your perception. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about the sentence that reveals genuine self-trust, the crucial distinction between words spoken from authentic certainty versus words performed while still requiring external confirmation underneath. If you deliver "that's how I remember it," while internally still desperate for him to eventually agree, the sentence's protective power diminishes considerably, precisely because the underlying vulnerability these three original sentences are designed to exploit remains genuinely active, regardless of how well-chosen your surface response happens to be. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about the cumulative long-term effect of consistently protecting yourself against these three specific patterns. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine self-trust rebuilds gradually through accumulated practice at trusting your own perception even when it's confidently challenged. Each time you successfully use one of these responses, briefly acknowledging disagreement without capitulating to it, you're not simply managing one specific conversation. You're actively strengthening exactly the psychological muscle this entire series has traced as central to genuine comprehensive healing. The capacity to hold your own accurate perception as valid and complete, entirely independent of whether anyone else, including him, ever agrees with it. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series about the difference between managing individual moments and addressing the deeper structural pattern underneath them. Remember everything we've traced throughout our conversation about shutting down a narcissist immediately, and the important caveat that shutting down individual moments doesn't resolve broader relationship dynamics. These three sentences and your effective responses to them represent tactics for protecting your own clarity in specific moments. They don't, on their own, resolve the question of whether a relationship requiring this level of ongoing, active defense against reality rewriting genuinely deserves your continued investment at all. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something genuinely important about frequency as diagnostic information. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition mattering more than isolated incident. If you find yourself needing to deploy these specific responses regularly, repeatedly, across ordinary conversation, rather than occasionally during genuine, isolated disagreement, this frequency itself deserves honest examination. A relationship characterized by occasional, ordinary miscommunication doesn't typically require this level of consistent, active defense against reality distortion. A relationship where these three sentences, or close variations of them, arrive with genuine regularity reflects something considerably more structural, worth evaluating with the same honest clarity this entire series has traced extensively throughout dozens of previous conversations. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. These three sentences, "that's not what happened," "you're remembering it wrong because you were upset," "everyone agrees with me on this," should represent specific, identifiable attempts to rewrite your reality, and learning to recognize and neutralize them genuinely protects your own accurate perception in the moments they arrive. But the deepest, most complete protection available was never actually about memorizing perfect counter-responses to specific sentences. It's about the comprehensive, sustained work this entire series has traced across dozens of previous conversations, rebuilding genuine self-trust thorough enough that these sentences, whenever they arrive, simply stop producing the doubt they're specifically engineered to create. You already know what happened. You already know what you experienced. These three sentences, however confidently delivered, however cleverly constructed, cannot actually change any of this unless you allow them to. Your accurate memory, your accurate perception, your accurate understanding of your own reality remains exactly, permanently yours, regardless of how many times he attempts to rewrite it, regardless of how confidently he asserts his alternative version, and regardless of whether he ever, genuinely, comes to see it your way at all. There's one more dimension worth adding here, because it addresses something practical worth carrying forward. What happens when these three sentences arrive not from a romantic partner specifically, but from a family member, a parent, or someone whose relationship to you carries additional layers of complexity? Years of history, ongoing family obligations, circumstances where complete separation isn't practically or emotionally straightforward. This deserves honest, direct examination, because family dynamics often present these same three sentences with an added layer of difficulty this conversation hasn't yet fully addressed. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how family relationships specifically can complicate even genuinely effective protective strategies. If a parent in particular delivers "that's not what happened" regarding your own childhood memories, this carries additional weight beyond ordinary disagreement, precisely because parents often hold a specific kind of authority over shared family narrative that other relationships don't carry in quite the same way. The same response applies, "that's how I remember it." But recognize that family-specific reality distortion often requires additional support beyond simply the phrase itself, sometimes including therapeutic work specifically focused on processing childhood memory that's been repeatedly, systematically contradicted over years or even decades. Here's something worth understanding about a related, specific situation. What if these three sentences arrive not in a single conversation, but as an accumulated pattern you've experienced across years, sometimes decades of family interaction, producing genuine, deep uncertainty about entire portions of your own childhood or family history? Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how cumulative gaslighting, sustained over considerable time, produces considerably more significant erosion than isolated instances ever could. If this describes your own experience, understand that rebuilding confidence in your own memory here often requires more than simply the response techniques we've traced throughout today's conversation. It frequently benefits from professional therapeutic support, sometimes combined with gathering outside perspective from other family members, old photographs, or documentation that existed independent of the specific person whose reality rewriting you've experienced most consistently. Here's a final consideration worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation, one that addresses something important about how these three sentences relate to your own inner voice over time, particularly if you've experienced them repeatedly across a significant relationship. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how sustained exposure to reality distortion can eventually produce an internalized version of these same sentences, a voice that sounds like your own thoughts but that actually echoes exactly the doubt these three sentences were originally designed to instill. If you notice yourself thinking, "maybe I am remembering this wrong," or "maybe I really am too sensitive," during moments entirely unconnected to any current conversation, this represents genuine evidence that these three sentences have taken up residence internally, requiring the same patient, deliberate work of rebuilding self-trust this entire series has traced extensively, now directed inward toward your own internalized doubt, rather than only outward toward the person originally delivering these sentences. This is ultimately the most important thing to carry forward from this entire conversation. These three sentences were never actually about accurately describing reality. They were always fundamentally about control, about maintaining a specific narrative that serves someone else's psychological needs at the direct cost of your own accurate perception and your own accumulated trust in yourself. Recognizing them clearly, responding to them calmly and consistently, and doing the deeper work of rebuilding genuine self-trust underneath these specific responses represents one of the most significant, most protective achievements available throughout your entire healing journey. Your reality was never actually up for negotiation, regardless of how confidently, how repeatedly, or how cleverly someone attempted to rewrite it. What happened, happened. What you remember accurately, built through your own direct lived experience rather than through anyone else's confident assertion otherwise. These three sentences, once you've genuinely internalized everything this conversation has traced, stop carrying the power they once held over your own sense of what's true. replaced instead by something considerably more stable, considerably more permanent, your own settled, unshakable knowledge of your own genuine, accurate reality belonging entirely and completely to you, now and for as long as you continue, patiently and consistently, choosing to trust it. There's one last consideration worth adding here because it completes something this entire conversation has been building toward without ever explicitly naming it. What does it actually feel like in your body and in your daily life once these three sentences genuinely stop having power over you? This deserves direct, concrete description because understanding the destination makes the journey there considerably easier to recognize as it unfolds. Early in this process, hearing "that's not what happened" or its variations likely produces an immediate physical response, a tightening, a flush of uncertainty, an urgent need to defend or prove your own memory before the conversation moves forward. This is worth understanding as completely normal, not evidence that the techniques we've traced throughout today's conversation aren't working. As you practice these responses consistently, something gradually shifts. The physical urgency lessens. The need to immediately defend your memory softens into something closer to mild, passing observation. Noting the sentence, noting your own settled certainty underneath it, and moving forward without the same immediate destabilizing charge these sentences once carried. Here's what genuine arrival at this destination typically looks like in practice. You'll notice one day that hearing one of these three sentences produces something closer to quiet recognition than genuine distress, an almost clinical awareness of "there's that pattern again," rather than the old familiar spiral of self-doubt. This shift doesn't happen through a single decisive moment. It happens gradually, through exactly the repeated practice this entire conversation has traced, until one day you notice, almost by surprise, that words which once destabilized you completely now simply pass through without leaving the same lasting mark. Here's a final thought worth carrying forward from everything we've examined throughout this entire conversation. Reality was never actually his to rewrite in the first place, no matter how many times he attempted it, no matter how confidently he delivered these three sentences, no matter how long you may have spent genuinely uncertain about whose version of events deserved more trust. What actually happened remains exactly what happened, fixed and unchangeable, regardless of anyone's confident insistence otherwise. Your memory of it, built through your own direct, lived experience, carries a kind of authority no amount of confident contradiction can genuinely overturn, even when it successfully produces temporary doubt along the way. You are the only person who was actually fully inside your own experience as it happened. He wasn't. No amount of confidence, no claimed consensus, no clever reframing of your own emotional response changes this basic, unshakable fact. His three sentences were always attempts to claim an authority over your own reality that he never actually possessed, dressed up convincingly enough to work for a while, but never actually true. You get to keep your reality now. Fully, completely, permanently. Not because you won an argument, not because he ever finally admitted you were right, but simply because it was always, from the very beginning, genuinely yours to keep, yours to remember accurately, yours to trust completely, yours to carry forward into every future conversation where someone might someday attempt these same three sentences again, only to find someone who no longer needs their approval in order to know, with complete and total certainty, exactly what's real. You are out of free messages until 11 a.m. Claude is AI and CA.